1 Corinthians chapter 10. That will be where we'll be picking up in our study here in just a moment. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Before we get into chapter 10, we want to go through our outline and then remind ourselves of what we've seen in the last two chapters. Chapters 8, 9, and 10 are a unit of chapters all dealing with eating the meats offered to idols. The book of 1 Corinthians, the outline that we've given, or the theme we said it has, is about contentions among you. And the key verse being in chapter 1. When in chapter 1 and in verses 10 and 11, Paul had reminded that they need to have no divisions among them, because it was actually reported that there were contentions among the church at Corinth. And as we said, pretty much every study, as we go throughout, the church at Corinth is clear as a church that has a great many problems. And that's how we remember the book. There were problems Paul learned about reported in the first 6 chapters. The problem of divisions in 1 through 4. The problem of fornication in 5 and 6. The problem of discipline or lack of discipline in chapter 5. And the problem of litigation in chapter 6. The second section begins in chapter 7 with questions of Corinthians asked Paul. We pointed out when we started chapter 7, it begins with, now concerning the things about which you wrote. And chapter 8 begins with, now concerning. Chapter 12, now concerning. And that phrase occurs throughout these chapters. So chapter 7, questions about marriage. Chapters 8, 9, and 10, where we are trying to finish up either this morning or Wednesdays, meat sacrifice to idols. Chapter 11 deals with headship and the covering, as well as abuse of the Lord's Supper. Chapter 12 through 14 deals with spiritual gifts, another unit of chapters. Chapter 15 then is false teaching on the resurrection. And chapter 16 was collection and salutations. We're still back here in section 2, subsection B, meats sacrifice to idols. And so before we get into chapter 10, let's quickly go through, turn back to chapter 8. We'll come into chapter 10 in a moment. Let's set the background for where we are. If you were to take these two chapters, if you were to take the last half of 9, or take chapter 9 as a whole, and take the first half of 10, and not realize that it's bookended by the same thing, you might think it has nothing to do with eating a meat sacrifice to idols. Now, the latter half of 10 brings that back up, and chapter 8 talks extensively about that. But chapter 9, verse 1 through chapter 10 and then verse 13, if you look at those, you almost said, if you take them out of there, it's not like there's some lessons you learn that it's not like you're missing the picture of eating a meat offered to idols. They were illustrations that we used. But chapter 8, 9, and 10 are all dealing with that eating the meats offered to idols. Chapter 8 beginning is dealing with warnings about the eating of those meats. When in chapter 8, he was talking about those who thought they had knowledge. We pointed out some translations have. The ESV, which is what I have in front of me, has the word knowledge in verse 1 there. Or all of us possess knowledge in quotation marks, and it seems that's their attitude. They're saying, we all possess knowledge, so this shouldn't be a problem. But Paul would point out in verse 7, not all possess this knowledge. Right? There were those who felt they couldn't eat these meats that might have been sacrificed to idols from the marketplace. And so Paul warned those here in verse 9 about abusing their liberties. He reminded them that their liberties could become a stumbling block. But take care that this right, or again, as we said, the word right or liberties, we can use them interchangeably here. Take care this right of yours does not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak. He points out that if we become a stumbling block to the weak, then we've destroyed, and we do something that would cause them to feel emboldened to do what we've done, but their conscience is not permitting. So we're eating meats offered to idols. We put that in front of them. For some reason, they feel like, you know what, I need to eat this. Maybe because they put it before me or whatever it is. And they eat that, but they eat it from a weak conscience. Then they sin. And what have we done? We've placed a stumbling block. And we've destroyed the brother for whom Christ died. Verse 11, we've sinned against our brother, but we've also sinned against Christ. Verse 12. Verse 13 then, of chapter 8, if food makes my brother stumble, I will never eat meat lest I make my brother stumble. If your liberties, if your rights cause your brother to sin, the solution is you need to be willing to
forego eating meats.
Forego those rights. Now again, as we said in chapter 9, maybe they're saying, well, Paul, you sort of talking a big talk, but would you really do that? Or it's just Paul's illustration. Whatever it is, chapter 9 is Paul's example. And so Paul talked about the 9 liberties, and we saw that last Sunday morning and again on Wednesday evening. How Paul gave up the right to support. And there's the eating and drinking and the having of a wife, as we pointed out. I think those three go together. He has the right to eat or drink. He receives support, and in return he has the right to have food. He has the right to take along or lead about a believing life. He has the right to that support. And he would point that out throughout chapter 9, going into verse 14. It's then in verse 15 he begins to talk about the fact that he gave up those liberties. And now he wasn't talking about giving up his liberties in verse 15 in hopes that maybe they'll support him. I'm talking about this, and maybe now that I'm talking about it, you'll support me. Of course, that's not what I'm doing. Paul would point out he preaches the gospel out of necessity. Right? He feels obligated. He's obligated to preach the gospel. It's not that Paul's doing it for the money. Paul's doing it because of the love for the gospel, love for souls, and he has that necessity laid upon him. He would talk about then later on how he became all things to all men. So as we pointed out, he may be among the Jews, so what's he going to practice? The Jewish customs. Now you're among the Gentiles, he might practice the Gentile customs, right? As long as they don't conflict with God's law. He's becoming all things to all men, as long as he has no compromise, does not have to compromise truth. He then would point out at the end of the chapter, where we ended at verses 24 to 27, that there's the need for self-discipline. Liberties are denied so not to become disqualified, and that takes self-control. Right? If he doesn't deny his liberties, he might, going back to chapter 8, place a stumbling block in the way of his brother. When that brother then does whatever it is that he does that violates his conscience, that brother then is guilty of sin. Since we place the stumbling block, we then are guilty of sin. Right? And then if we're guilty of sin, we've thus become disqualified. Right? We're running this race, but we're not what we need to be. Paul's pointing out that the liberties are denied so he's not to become disqualified. And he points out that takes some self-control, verse 25. That takes some discipline, verse 27. Chapter 10 now. Take heed lest you fall. Chapter 10 is written more to deal with the strong brother, who's lifted up and seems to think, well, I have no problem. And they're becoming lifted up, and Paul's pointing out in this chapter, you need to take heed. You need to be careful lest you fall. Really two divisions here to the chapter we're going to look at. The example of Israel in 1 to 13. And then the eating of meats offered to idols in 14 through chapter 11 and verse 1. Let's take some time here and go through the example of Israel. Well, let's begin with this. Israel was blessed. As Paul's going to point out this example of Israel, I believe he's paralleling them. He doesn't draw a direct parallel with that. But we sometime back earlier this year, we had a lesson on warnings and encouragements about sin and temptation in this chapter. We talked about the parallel. Here they were blessed, and there's some parallels we can draw to ours. We're not going to spend time through all those parallels this morning, but we want to understand they were greatly blessed. Look at verse 1 beginning. For I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses into the cloud and into the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank from the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. And so what Paul is pointing out here in the early part of this chapter is, listen, Israel was greatly blessed. Here you've got them passing under the cloud and passing through the sea. They go through the sea, right? They were baptized in Moses, the cloud, and into the sea. And here we go through where they passed the cloud between them, and they passed through the sea and were saved. God bless them. They ate the same spiritual food. Now there's some debate there that perhaps the spiritual food that he's talking about is that they had his law. But it could be, I think it may fit, is that God blessed them with physical food, but he blessed them in ways that others were not blessed. Right? The manna that fell from heaven, because of their relationship to him. He didn't just give that to everybody, but he took care and provided for them because they were his children. They were his people. And so God blessed them. Now either way, whichever position you take, the point ultimately is God blessed them either by giving his law or by giving them the physical food because of that relationship. Whatever side you take, the answer is, the point still remains the same. God blessed them. Verse 4, all drank from the same same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. Now here's where I think this is tying into the food, and God blessing them because of their relationship. They drank from the rock that followed them. You remember that as you go throughout the history of Israel, there were two occasions in which Israel says, we have no water, and God gave them water by Moses. Well, both times he was striking, but he was supposed to strike and speak to a rock. Now, and in the literal sense, was there actually a rock following them everywhere they went? Like, here's an actual rock. No.
It's a metaphor.
It's a metaphor, right? Where they were, God blessed them from the water from the rock. It was as if the rock that provided water was following them. Well, who ultimately was that rock? It wasn't a physical rock. It was Christ, right? God is with them. God is blessing them. That's the point. That God took care of. God provided for Israel. He gave them food. He gave them drink. He gave them safety. In verse 5 through 10, he was not pleased with most of them. Look at verse 5. Nevertheless, with most of them God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. What he's just done is said they were blessed. Here's their blessings. And in spite of all their blessings, God was not pleased with most of them. Now, I was going to use some illustrations here in a minute, but here's the point he's trying to make. He's going to come back to this later on in verse 11, that now these things happen as an example, as he's trying to warn them. Don't think just because you've received blessings from God, you can't, what?
You can't assume that you're pleasing God.
You can't assume you're pleasing God, and you can't assume that you're not going to fall away. God blessed Israel greatly, and yet with the majority of them, God was not pleased. In fact, he's going to go throughout here the next several verses, 6 through 10, and give examples of this. And this is just a small sample size of the things Israel had done. But let's just look at what they did. Verse 6, now these things took place as examples for us, that we might not desire evil as they did. If you have a reference Bible, probably references Numbers 11, 4, 33, and then 33 and 34 of the same chapter. So here it says, well, they desired evil. Verse 7, do not be idolaters as some of them were, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Now what's that a reference to? The golden calf. Exodus chapter 32. That phrase occurs, that's at the end of the half there, about the people sit down to eat and drink and rose up to play. That occurs in Exodus 32. So he's referencing the story there. If you write in your Bibles, you might, I have it written down in mine, reference each story. So when you have time to go back and look through each of these stories of Israel and the things they did. So Numbers 11, particularly 4 and then 33 and 34, but Numbers 11 and verse 6. Verse 7, Exodus 32. Verse 8, we must not indulge in sexual immorality as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in a single day. Now I'm going to come back and deal with that 23,000 in a second. But let's do with the event first. What event are we talking about? We refer to this as verse 8. This is referred to often as Bel of Peor. This is the event with the Midianites. Remember, this is where you've got the story of Balaam and Balak. We learned this from the New Testament, where Balak calls Balaam and says, would you curse the people? And then he can only say what God tells him, and so he blesses them, and it happens time and time again. And we know from the New Testament, Balaam then gives Balak an idea that basically, listen, I can't curse them, but if you can get them to commit sin, then God's going to punish them. And it was Balaam's idea. And so the people come out, and you may recall in, this is Numbers 25, that's where you got the man who just sort of, he's got this woman with him, and he's just sort of marching through the camp onto his tent as if he's so proud of the immorality he's got to commit. And that's where Phinehas, the son of Eleazar. So Eleazar is the son of Aaron. He's a priest. He later will become high priest in the place of Aaron. When Aaron dies, his son goes in and runs him through with a spear, and the plague finally stops. And that's the event referenced in verse 8. Now, do want to reference this. Keep your finger here, but I want you to go to Numbers chapter 25 with me for just a moment. This is what I want to reference while we're here. I just want to spend just a second on it to reference this, because there's a question that comes up by critics of the Bible concerning Numbers 25 and here in 1 Corinthians. Numbers 25 and verse 9. Nevertheless, those who died by the plague were 24,000. Now go back to 1 Corinthians. And how many did you say died in verse 8? 23,000. So there are critics of the Bible who say, well, you see the Bible contradictions at one time it's 24, one time it's 23. Here's what I think is an explanation for that. I think it makes sense based on the wording. You notice in Numbers 25 and verse 9, it says, those who died by the plague were 24,000. I think this is a possible explanation that I think fits best with the text. But in 1 Corinthians, he said 23,000 fell in what? One day. So I think it's an possible answer to that is that there's this plague taking place, and 24,000 died, but in the one day there was 23. Here's an illustration of that. If you heard of an accident and 150 people died, but it was reported that on the day of the accident 145 people died, you would realize, you know what that means? 5 of them died later on, right? They died from whatever that accident was, but they didn't die on the day of that, right? It was another day. I think that's an explanation that based on the wording here in 1 Corinthians makes sense, that he's saying, listen, that 23,000 fell on a single day, but in Numbers 25 it's saying that for that plague that was sent, it was a total of 24,000. So 1,000 of them, I think the explanation fits best, 1,000 of them died on another day from that plague.
We don't have Fox News updates.
Yeah, there's not the instant update. So when Paul alludes to 23, I think this one fits best. When somebody raises that question, I think it's very important the use of, and all of that's important, right? We looked at this in chapter 2. God chooses the words. Right? They're given by the Holy Spirit. That's why Paul argues on the difference between offspring and offsprings. Because of the importance of the words, it's specifically chosen that in 1 Corinthians it says, died in a single day. Verse 9 now. It was not put Christ to the test, and some of them did and were destroyed by serpents. That's Numbers chapter 21. And the Lord grumbled, and some of them did and were destroyed by the destroyer. Good luck figuring the specific one that is. That was just about every single week, it seemed. Every few chapters, it seems you have them grumbling and some of them being destroyed. But perhaps Numbers 14 would be the best to fix that, which is the case where the spies come back. And now they're saying, but listen, we can't go in and we can't take the land. And yet the point is being made to them is, no, but you can. And yet they were punished because they grumbled and complained that we can't do it. But again, there's a number of occasions. So here they are again. I'll read them through. If you didn't get them, you want to write them down. Verse 6, Numbers 11. Verse 6 is Numbers 11. Verse 7, Exodus chapter 32. So verse 7 is Exodus 32. Verse 8 is Numbers 25. Numbers 25. Verse 9 is Numbers chapter 21. That's the story with the bronze serpent there. Numbers 21. And then number 10, again, could be a number of examples, but I think Numbers 14. Your reference Bible probably alludes to, if you have a Bible that has references, it will allude to Numbers 14 as being that reference, where they grumbled about not being able to take the land, and God punished them, but not just punished some that day, all those that were 20 older were punished and couldn't enter into the promised land with the exception of Joshua and Caleb. So, those seem to be the references. Now, again, I said when we started this chapter, I said chapter 9, chapter 10. If you don't realize they're part of the unit, you don't look at the last half of chapter 10, you might just look at this and say, well, Paul's just reminding them you just need to be careful because of Israel. Right? He's just telling them, rehearsing a little bit about the history of Israel. But he's leading up to a point, and that is, they were blessed, yet God was not pleased with them, so take heed to yourselves. Right? If you're just because you're blessed doesn't mean you're necessarily doesn't mean that you can't fall out of that relationship you have with God. And let me note to this, just because somebody's blessed doesn't mean they're in a right relationship with God in the first place. Some people look at it and say, well, we receive these blessings, somebody must be doing what's right because they have all these material things, and that's not necessarily true. Yes.
John Ren's familiar with Romans 15:4, where we study, the things written aforetime are written for let our learning, so that we through patience and confidence of the Scripture might have hope. So if we don't look at these things and derive a benefit and apply it in our own life, it's basically no benefit.
Absolutely, you're right. Absolutely. So we've got to take, and he's going to point out here in verse 11, and make that application to avoid it. And we'll make more specifics of that when we get to verse 14 in a minute. Verse 11 now. Now these things happened to them as an example. But they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the ages has come. Therefore let anyone who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. No temptation is overtaking you except that is common to man. God is faithful, and He will not allow you to be tempted beyond your ability. But with the temptation He will also provide a way of escape that you may be able to enjoy it. So, a couple of things let's note here. We talked about this passage a little bit a couple of weeks ago when we talked about understanding and overcoming sin and overcoming it. So we're not going to spend a great deal of time here. But let's listen to a few things here on this passage, the specific text. So, verse 11, this is an example. You be careful then that you don't fall away. Verse 12, let anyone who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. I think that's the point. There are those who it seems you go back and listen to them, you go, well, I can go to the temple, I can eat this meat, and I know an idol is nothing. In terms of actually eating the meat that has been offered to the idols, what's wrong with eating that meat? Nothing. As long as it's not done in honor to or worship of that idol. We'll come back to that in a minute. But it seems some of them are almost viewed as if, well, I can eat it if they say it's in honor of, because I know that in reality that idol is absolutely nothing. And they're becoming lifted up. Well, we all possess knowledge, and what he's reminding them of is, you need to be careful. You think let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. You need to be careful. You think you're strong. You think you can't fall, but let me tell you,
you can't.
But then he comes to verse 12, and you listen to verse 12 and you think, well, okay, that doesn't sound very good. But verse 12 is then a reminder, or verse 13 rather, you can fall, but it ultimately is up to who?
The individual.
The individual. Let no temptation is overtaking you that is not common to man. Now, we use that verse a lot of times in that sense. We go to that passage and we say, you see, no matter what we're suffering through, it's a temptation that is common to man. Everybody's tempted. Somebody else is going through that. Is that true? Yes, that's true. Listen to the American Standard of 1901. A little bit wood, so bear with me just a minute as we read this here. There hath no temptation taken you, but such as man can bear. But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that ye are able, but will with the temptation make also the way of escape, that ye may be able to endure it. So he takes that as is common to man and renders it as man can bear. That seems to be, based on the original, what would fit best is the point is not the temptation that everybody else endures, but the temptation is common to the point that everybody has to go through temptation and everybody can endure or bear it. That's the point. No temptation is overtaking you except that man can bear through. Look again what he says after that. God is faithful and will not allow you to be tempted beyond your ability. We've got to be careful. We hear this phrase sometimes, and if we're not careful, we may use it ourselves. I just couldn't help myself. And so we say we're guilty of something, and say, well, I just couldn't help myself.
I think we're being warned here of overconfidence. And, Paul said he had to buffet his body daily, lest after teaching others he be disqualified. And then in Galatians chapter 6, if somebody is overtaken in any trespass, what ye are spiritual, what restore such one how the Spirit means, doing what consider yourself, lest you also be tempted. And then you think, and all these things should form our heart on how vulnerable we are to sin. And then when Jesus said, the first cock crows, you're going to deny me 3 times. Peter's like, well, I can visualize these other guys, I can see, but not me, Lord. Well, what was he was overconfident? I mean, he was proud, and as a result, what he did, he fell flat on his face. So we got to be careful to look down on somebody when they're struggling with sin, or think, I would never do something like that, or whatever like that, because that stems from pride. And I know we can do all things through Christ who strengthens us. And I know the context there, we've talked about for the context. But in a broader sense, we have to recognize our reliance upon Jesus in order for this endurance. But if we're so confident I can do this on my own, we're going to fall flat on our face.
Absolutely, you're right. And that verse 12 is the verse we read it, and I would say about 95, if not closer to 100% of the time, maybe more like 99% of the time we read that passage. One of the first things we hear afterwards is Peter is a classic example of it, and allude to him about how he fits that description. Right? He was lifted up, not me. Everybody Everybody else might, but not me. And the book of Proverbs will put out pride comes before the fall, before destruction. Yes.
Remember back in the 70s, a comedian by the name of Flip Wilson?
No.
Anyway, the devil made me do it. People would use that excuse, no, it's still us that gives into the devil.
Right.
God allowed the devil and Satan to tempt Job. All purpose, you can't kill him. Look at all the stuff that he went through, and still didn't.
You're right, and the story of Job shows that God places restrictions on Satan. You can do this, but you can't do that. Right? There were the restrictions given there, keeping him from going to doing something else to Job, which tells us that when God says we're not going to be tempted beyond our ability, then I can trust that I'm not going to be tempted beyond my ability. Right? God's placed those limitations on Satan. Yes.
I'm thinking too, going back a little bit, this expanded on maybe what the immediate study is, but the part of a stumbling block, we can do that in matters of, our own choice and preferential things, non-doctrination. But I've got to be careful too. I could be a stumbling block like to you. I could lead you to gossip, let's say, about other people. Maybe you wouldn't have done that, but I can kind of lead you into that. I can be the one that kind of starts the conversation in that direction. So I got to be careful I'm not a stumbling block, not only in these matters of judgment or whatever, but also got to watch how I influence somebody else, you know what I mean? Because I could be a stumbling block there, and I think in the broader sense that's what Jesus talked about, making one of these little ones sin. So I've got to be careful in all matters and not make a stumbling block.
Absolutely, you're right. Let's finish up here in verse 13, and then we're going to pick up at 14 here on Wednesday. We've got a couple minutes remaining, a couple of things we want to point out. So again, we won't be tempted beyond our ability, but with the temptation will also be provided the way of escape. You've heard me use this illustration before. You look around, if this building was to catch fire in the middle of the auditorium, what are you going to do? You're going to look for the exercise, right? If you're in the middle of any building and it catches fire, the first thing you're going to look for is the exit sign, right? You're going to try to find a way to escape. And that's what we're going to do. And the point is that in temptation there is a way of escape. This word escape is from the Greek word ekbasis. Ek means out of, from, by, or away. And basis means a stepping or a walking. And the idea is there's always a way of walking away, or walking out of, or away or from the temptation. Right? So here's temptation. There's always a way of escape. Now, I think what happens is sometimes we say, well, I couldn't help myself. And what we need to understand is there are moments where we may be weaker. There are moments where we will be weaker. And in those moments, we may be more likely to give in. But sometimes we mistake being weak for being completely and totally helpless and nothing we can do to escape. And what the Bible points out is, here in 1 Corinthians 10, there's always, look again, but no temptation has overtaken you except as is common to man. Or again, the American Standard, no temptation has overtaken you, man, that he cannot bear. But God is faithful, which tells me, by the way, when he says it, I can believe it, and will not allow you to be tempted beyond your ability, but with the temptation will also provide a way of escape that you may be able to endure it. I may be weak in a moment, and I may be more likely to give in then than I would have at another time. But it doesn't mean that I can't help myself, right? I can escape. There's always a way of escape. What we have to simply do is look for the exit signs to get out of that situation. Lord willing, we'll pick up in verse 14 and continue our study on eating the meat sacrificed to idols and conclude that on Wednesday evening. Also, chapter 11 outlines are on the table in the back.